Welcome to the Rules of the Checkride, Part 4, Applicable Knowledge Evaluation Standards. Please, if you haven't watched the introduction, the psychology of the pilot's checkride, or the Rules of the Checkride's Part 1 to 3 videos, please exit now and watch them first. These videos follow a sequence and viewed otherwise will lessen its effects and may confuse you. First question. How does the FAA evaluation standards apply during the oral portion of the test? I'm glad when pilots ask these questions because it is a biggie. Let me direct you to the General Aviation Airman Designee Handbook, also known as FAA Order 8900.2. In Section 2, page 7-28, you'll find 3 guidelines that convey to pilots examiners how to determine if a pilot meets acceptable or satisfactory knowledge of the standards during a practical test. It is really important for flight instructors and pilots to understand exactly what the order implies. After you read the 3 guidelines, even though they are well defined, the first impression is that they contradict each other. Therefore, we need to look at them individually, and once understood, they will help the examiner to conduct a thorough and fair evaluation. They help your flight instructor to understand how you must be prepared, and they'll help you to understand what to expect during the oral evaluation. Please be advised that for the sake of better understanding of these guidelines, I have changed the sequence in which they appear in the FAA order, but not its contents. The first guideline states that the pilot applicant must meet the acceptable or satisfactory standards of knowledge of each task. This almost implies a perfect score. In reality, that is not so. In order to understand this guideline, you must first know the answer to the next question. What does acceptable or satisfactory knowledge of a task means? The acceptable or satisfactory knowledge of a task is determined by the overall acceptable knowledge of all the elements that comprise a task. So, the following question is, what does acceptable or satisfactory knowledge of an element means? According to the FAA, acceptable or satisfactory knowledge of an element is that the correct responses to the questions should reflect that the applicant has a clear understanding of the required element in question. So how the examiner does know when the acceptable knowledge of an element has been demonstrated? In order to explain that, let's look at a perfect world evaluation in which the applicant is able to answer correctly without missing a beat all the questions pertaining to one element in a particular task. This is possible, but not seldom. In a real-world scenario, however, the applicant, when explaining an element, especially a complex element of a task, is allowed to give incorrect, confusing, or unrelated answers to the examiner's question, provided that the examiner determines that the pilot has a clear understanding of the fundamental part of the element in question. In other words, the errors may not be disqualifying in nature. So the oral will continue. How the examiner does know when the acceptable knowledge standards of a task has been demonstrated. Let's look at a perfect world evaluation again, in which the applicant is able to answer correctly without missing a beat all the questions pertaining to all the elements in a particular task. This, although possible, it is extremely rare. The task will be considered satisfactory if the applicant shows a clear understanding of the fundamental parts of all the elements within the task, even though the applicant gave some incorrect, confused, or unrelated answers to the examiner's questions in one or more of the required elements. This is allowed under guideline number 2, which reads, if the applicant consistently gives incorrect, confused, or unrelated answers to the examiner's question, a notice of disapproval of the application must be issued. However, regardless of how complex the element is, if the applicant consistently gives incorrect, confused, or unrelated answers to the examiner's question, showing a lack of clear understanding of the fundamental parts of the element in question, the test will be terminated. This guideline is the one that challenges the examiner's judgment simply because the decision that you do or don't meet the FAA acceptable knowledge standards is based on each individual test and pilot. And in addition, the quality and quantity of the existing knowledge versus the quality and quantity of the missing knowledge. If, in the examiner's judgment, the existing knowledge of the required elements tips the scale, the task is satisfactory. On the other hand, if the missing knowledge of the required elements tips the scale, the test will be terminated. This is where examiners really do shine. By now, it seems that you're allowed nearly unlimited amount of incorrect, confused, or unrelated answers, as you probably noted the word consistently in the second guideline, which, by the way, is the operative word in that guideline. And according to Merriam-Webster's, means done the same way or to the same degree over a period of time. So in practice, it means more than once or twice. Having said that, keep in mind that there are well-placed limits as to how much you are allowed not to know, as we're just about to find out by reading guideline number 3, which says it is not uncommon for only 1 or 2 incorrect answers to require the issuance of a notice of disapproval during the oral portion of a practical test. Okay, what happened here? What do you mean? We're doing so good here, everything was fine. This guideline implies that there is very little room to wiggle, and it is completely opposite to guideline 2. However, by understanding it, we will find the explanation to this paradox. Keep in mind that this guideline applies to simple as well as complex elements and tasks. How this guideline does apply to the evaluation of an element. Now, let me give you an example where just 2 unsatisfactory answers will suffice to stop the oral test. If the examiner is evaluating the National Airspace System and creates a scenario to see if you can explain a required element, such as the operating rules for Class Bravo airspace, and the scenario involves the required procedure for penetrating Class Bravo, and you reply that a clearance to enter Class Bravo is not required, obviously, that is the wrong answer. However, the examiner will allow you to finish the explanation and will follow up with another scenario that involves Class Bravo clearances. This is done to really determine if you just misspoke, was nervous, or really didn't know. If the answer to the second question is also incorrect, then the examiner may assume that you have no acceptable knowledge of the required procedure to operate in Class Bravo airspace and will terminate the test. Because although simple in nature, it is a required element. On the other hand, if your answer to the second question is correct, then the original scenario may be visited again to confirm the level of knowledge. If satisfactory, you meet the acceptable knowledge standards for the particular element and the oral will continue. How this guideline does apply to the evaluation of a task. This is an example where an unsatisfactory answer to just one question will suffice to stop the oral test. If the examiner asks you a question about a certain required element or task, and you demonstrate a complete lack of knowledge about that element or task, the examiner will stop the oral right there. A commercial pilot applicant was asked, what is the recommended speed for performing an accelerated stall? The pilot's reply, I've never done one of those. I don't know what an accelerated stall is. This showed complete lack of knowledge of a required task, and a notice of disapproval was issued. Believe me, this is a true story. This guideline, however, makes the examiner's job really easy because the evidence that you don't meet the acceptable knowledge standards for the element or task, it's clear cut. Therefore, the test will be terminated. After analyzing all these guidelines, we can conclude that the most important thing you need to remember about your performance during the oral portion of the test is a pilot does not have to know everything. You're allowed not to know. Perfection is not the standards. Remember, the written test, you could have been wrong 30% of the time and still be eligible for a practical test. Unfortunately, most of the pilots to whom I've issued a notice of disapproval during the oral test believe they need to be perfect, which means knowing everything, a belief that usually doesn't end well. Many talented lawyers, doctors, and engineers have graduated, are practicing, and didn't get straight A's. Pilots, my friends, are no different. How will I know when the oral test begins? The FAA requires that the examiner informs you when the oral portion will begin. Only the questions that are asked after you hear and confirm that the test has begun shall be evaluated.